Well, listen, dearest people, here we are for 60 minutes. Thank you, Mary. Just to talk about who knows what, but coming from the Buddha. It's all coming from the Buddha. You mightn't recognize it in my rough Australian accent and my colloquial terms, but it is Buddhism, I promise you. And I think that's what's good. If we put it down to earth in really not 14th century or 2000 years ago language, it kind of really helps us kind of, get the plot, So how to be our own therapist. So the bottom line, so we think, okay, just motivate. We think for 1 hour, we're going to be here together, listen, think about, analyze these ideas. And that includes me, I promise. And so we can use these as tools. This is the whole point. It's practical tools to do what? To help us navigate our own crazy minds and navigate this, which means we can then navigate this crazy world and not go mad. So we can not only become more happy and fulfilled ourselves and more courageous, but we can be more useful. That's the bottom line, I promise. That's the two wings of the bird, wisdom and compassion, Sounds kind of noble saying wisdom, but that really is the nuts and bolts of what we talk about in these sessions. Taking the Buddhist tools, learning how to work with our body, our speech, and our mind so that we can finally really develop our mind, lessen the neuroses and the fears and the up and down like yo-yo, and grow the goodness so we become more stable and therefore more useful. That's it. That's the essence of what Buddha's saying. It's hard to see It's really hard to see that. We can't get past all the language and the different culture, but that's exactly what it is. And the fact is, when we realize also that when we think of religion, like I talk all the time, certainly in the materialist world and in the world that's driven by the kind of, the European, well, yes, European, yeah, coming from that little piece of land called Israel, or the religions we call, it's not quite Europe, but Islam, Christianity and Judaism, there's an absolute assumption, isn't there, that religion equals a creator. And that means believing in something, because you can't prove that God is right. That would be very arrogant. They're the kind of the dominant, in the modern world, they're the dominant main religion. So the assumption about religion is that. But then you ask a Buddhist, you ask a Tibetan, are you religious? Well, they say, of course I am. So then what do Tibetans mean by that? If they don't believe in a creator, what do they mean by religious? Well, it just means, really, if you think about it, if the mind is central in Buddhism, basically then Buddha's a psychologist. Well, that seems to me, for us, contradiction. Religious is one thing and talks about a soul and a spirit and it's mystical. And then you talk about, psychology, which seems very grounded and down to earth. Well, if you look into Buddhism, it's exactly what we ever talk about. Buddha didn't say psychology, he didn't speak Greek, for God's sake. But he deals with the mind. He doesn't have a word for things. He doesn't have another word. We have body, mind, and soul. He doesn't have a separate word. Everything is mind, but it happens to be, he says it's not physical. He happens to be, it goes back and back and back and goes forward, forward, forward. It happens to be that it's not created by anybody. These are the radical differences in Buddha's view of the universe, So Buddha, of course, Buddha's religious philosophy, religious meaning spiritual, if you like, meaning working with what's inside, if you really think about it. That's what being spiritual in Buddhist terms means. It means being your own psychologist, being your own therapist, being your own psychologist. Because your mind is what runs the world. Your mind is what runs your life. Your mind is what makes you happy or unhappy. Your mind is what makes your body and speech do things. Your mind runs the show. And that's really the essence of what Buddha's saying, which is quite fundamentally different. If we think we're Christians, God runs the show. If you're a Muslim, God runs the show. If you're a materialist, we're trying to work it out still. And if you're a Buddhist, you run the show. That's not a joke. It's serious. And I love that. I love that. Buddha is this person out there who's done this job of radically changing his mind, ridding the mind of all the rubbish, which is what he's found is possible, developing to perfection all the goodness and wisdom and clarity and confidence and courage and the rest. That's what he's done. That's his job. That's what he's done. And all he's saying is, this is what I've done. I found methods to stop suffering and get happiness. Over to you, honey child, up to you if you want to use my methods. That's the approach to Buddha, not you must believe what I say. And I'm not being rude about that. If you want to believe in a creator, you're very welcome. But that's not the Buddhist view. And we've got to remember that. It sounds like, Buddhism sounds like any other religion. Don't do this and don't do that. It sounds very moralistic. But the Buddha's fundamental difference is there's no such thing as a creator. He argues with that. He's not being rude. He says from his own experience, he's found that that's not viable. We are the creators of our world. We are the ones who come into this life programmed with our past stuff, and everything we think and do and say programs us and produces the next person we become. We produce ourselves, basically. We don't need creating by somebody else. So, of course, the point that I find so powerful about that, the experiential implication of that is, guess what? We're the boss. When we know that, then we change completely. Because the irony of ego, this is what's so interesting, the irony of ego, as Lama Yeshe would say, when he first met the Western hippies, the irony of ego is it's the self-pity me, as he called it, the self-pity me. That sounds kind of cruel, because the world is a terrible place. Bad things do happen. But when you look more and more into yourself and you see more and more the energy of attachment, the energy of anger, the energy of jealousy, the energy of resentment, the energy of arrogance and low self-esteem, it is that. It's like paralysis and it's self-pity. And I'm not being cruel. We need to see that. And when we start to take control, when we start to be our own therapist, when we start to, if we have the view of karma, realizing whatever we meet, we've created in the past, it's coming back to us, it's in front of us, all the good and the bad, then we start to become powerful. Then we start to become courageous. Then we start to grow up and stop self-pity. And then we're really on track. That's the main implication for me, that's for sure. I know when I first heard Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe talking, back in 76 in Chenrezig Institute in Australia, right? Queensland. My very first teaching, exactly in June, 1976, however many years ago that is, it was in June. I remember vividly because Chenrezig Institute was the first center in the FPMT after Asia. Well, there was Kopan, then Tushita and Dharamsala, and then the third center was Chenrezig Institute. In 1974 it started. Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa came and taught, and then four of the students, Nick Rebush, who now runs Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive, and his girlfriend at the time was Yeshe Kardo, an Australian nun, who for many years ran the Karuna Hospice in Brisbane. She now is retired from that job. And then two other people who live at Chenrezig Institute, now live in Queensland, Tom and Kathy. The four of them had bought this land to grow marijuana on, So then they went to Kathmandu and met the Lamas, and they became Buddhists. So then they offered one of these pieces of land to Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe. And that became what's called Chenrezig Institute. And I went there 2 years later. So they just built, I remember it vividly because they just built the Gompa, the big meditation hall. And Queensland, for you Americans, it's like Florida. It's the tropics. Except it's upside down, the tropics is the north in Australia because we're close to but Americans, south is, as you know, Australia's upside down, if you like. So anyway, it's the tropics and it's the winter. June is midwinter right now in Australia. It's midwinter, you people. And I never forget when I hadn't been to Queensland before. I'd been in Europe all these years doing all my political activity, and I wanted something spiritual again. I got back to Australia. I was doing martial arts, and then I saw this poster about Lama Yeshe, so I thought I'd go. So I went, and all I know is this Gompa had just been built in very Queensland style. The type of architecture in Queensland for the tropics is very wonderful. It's the buildings, the old-fashioned buildings, built on stilts, and then the floor so the breezes can come through. It was very beautifully built, so it was really adapting to that kind of environment. So anyway, it was not quite finished, and typically a lot of the things in Queensland. The windows, what they call louver windows, those slatted windows, those slats, I don't know if they call them louver. Do you call them louver windows? We call them louver windows in Australia. It's a French word. They're slats, and you open them up, and they're slats, glass. So all I know is they hadn't got the windows in. So everybody in Queensland says, oh, it's the tropics here, it's lovely weather. Well, all I tell you is Chenrezig's on a hill, a bit of a hill, and it was the most freezing weather for that 2 months I was there. The wind blowing like a gale through these wretched windows where there were no windows, with 200 people in the Gompa packed to the gills, and the floor had cracks in the beams and the wood. So it was like freezing cold. I'll never forget. But I sat there for 2 whole months. 1 month of Lama Zopa teaching the Lamrim, and I swear it was completely straight out of 14th century Tibet, every word he said. I didn't understand a word he said, but I heard the words, but I kept saying to myself, where's the Buddhism, So it's taken me these, 46, 47 years, 48 by now, no, 46, whatever, to try and put it in my own language, because it's all there, but I couldn't hear it. I knew there was something there, I knew there was something there. But then Lama Yeshe would come along and give a talk in the evening, and I would sigh with relief. Oh, thank God, I thought, that makes sense. That, because he always talked in this way of down-to-earth psychology. He got it to the essence, and that's, I'm his daughter. So for me, that's what's most powerful for us. When we can see this, when we can understand the essence of what's going on in Buddhism, not just all the ritual packages and become like a Japanese person and bow like a Japanese or bow down like a Tibetan. The packaging is just cultural, Even the way the words are structured is cultural. That's why we've got to get to the essence of the words, not just chuck out the baby with the bathwater and make up our own words. We've got to hear it, and then put it into the words that make sense to us. This is so important. Now, I felt that right at that time. I remember I felt there was something here. I knew it was my path. I stuck around for 2 months. It was a great struggle, I tell you. And I knew that somehow it's our job at this time, 50 years. I mean, at that point, 1974, only 20 years before that, the Tibetans had come into the world, come out of Tibet over the mountains. They were totally isolated all those centuries. So it seemed to me, you could see that Buddhism was becoming more and more popular back then even. And it was just somehow, it seemed like, time is now our job. It's our job now, the time in the West, which is so-called West, Anyway, here we are all these 46 years later, and here I am these 46 years later, trying to do my best to do that job. But you've got to internalize it first. You can't just have it theoretical, you've got to make sense to you first. And that's the wisdom wing. You do the work yourself. Now, it's so obvious in any field of work. It's obvious you've got to have. You can have compassion. This is a good point. You can have compassion, which is empathy with the suffering of others. It's really clear. We have that. But as the Dalai Lama says, compassion is not enough. You've got to have wisdom. As Lama Zopa says, compassion is not enough. Meaning well is not enough. You've got to have wisdom. And in spiritual stuff, that's confusing to us. But if I want to help people who are sick, I can have as much compassion as I like. But if I don't even know how to apply a Band-Aid, what good am I? I've got to learn medicine. It's sort of obvious, but we don't get that when it comes to spiritual stuff. So the compassion wing is you see other people suffering. So then you think, how can I help? But you've got to know how to help. So you first got to know it yourself. You've got to know your own mind. And that's Buddha's key point. In the Four Noble Truths, he talks about it. The very first one is, there is suffering. The second one, there are causes. The third is, you can get rid of suffering and its causes. And the fourth is how to do it. So you've got to do it first. How can you teach nutrition if you haven't learned it first? How can you help a person play piano if you haven't learned it first? How can you help a person stop suffering if you haven't begun to know the theories first? It's sort of obvious. And that's why you can't. And that's why I like in the West, it's interesting. It seems to me, way back, maybe 50, 60 years ago, maybe 100 years before Mr. Freud came along, there were all these kind of psychiatrists, all white men, of course, who were kind of intellectual and knew all about the brain. And they would look down with disdain at these poor mental patients and give them pills. But to think that they would need to do any work themselves, that would be beyond belief. But now, at least when people study therapy and counseling these days, you see it in the West, it's wonderful. You've got to do it yourself because we're all in the same boat, and that's what Buddha's telling us. You've got to know your own mind. So then, okay, when he says there is suffering, and this is also the point, this is what's difficult for us. When we say suffering right now, from our view, the automatic, obvious view, we look at the world, and what we mean by that is the poor people, the sick people, the people suffering from sexism, the people suffering from racism, and that all these exist. There's no question. This is a really evident level of suffering. The world is very cruel. People harm others. This is really obvious. But the Buddha's view, and this is why if we don't do the wisdom wing, this doesn't make any sense to us. Buddha's suggesting that we can have compassion for everybody. So the only way to understand that is to know that everybody's suffering. And the only way to understand that is to know what Buddha means by suffering. And that's why you've got to study the Four Noble Truths. It's the first teaching Buddha gave, He laid out his trip. He laid out what he'd found to be true. So the first one, there is suffering. And this is the part that's shocking. And this is the wisdom wing. And if you don't do this for you, you'll never be able to have compassion for anybody but a few children and dogs, which is about all we have compassion for, because we only have compassion for innocent victims. So what does Buddha say? This is the tough part. He says there are three kinds of suffering. The first kind is that one, the suffering of suffering, was when the bad things happen. That we can see. But the second one is more tricky. He calls it the suffering of change. And it means what we mean by happiness. He says basically what we mean by suffering is when the bad things happen. And what we mean by happiness is when the good things happen. And that's a reasonable analysis. It's good enough. But the Buddha would say there's some fault in that analysis because we're not factoring in the delusions. And that's his particular trip, that we've got immense attachment, this bottomless pit. And that's the second kind of suffering, to learn to know about our own mind. So attachment, as far as the Buddha is concerned, is the main cause of all suffering on the planet. And that's pretty abstract unless we learn to see what he means. So what does he mean? And this is where Buddha's trip. The main cause of suffering is the mind. So The first kind of suffering is the suffering of suffering when the bad things happen. And he has an explanation for that. He calls it karma. And that means we have to take, this is going back to the first one, that means we have to take the assumption, if we wanted to understand Buddha's teachings, that our mind has come from before. You didn't get created in your womb by your mother. You didn't get created in the womb by God. You didn't start from nowhere. The Buddha's deal, and that's what's very different, you go back and back. Your Buddha, your mind goes back and back. And you come into this life. I came into this life programmed with my tendencies, my experiences from my past actions. This is Buddha's fundamental point. And if we can hear it in an optimistic way, it's very powerful, because it means all the good things that happened to me as well, I created them, as well as the bad. We only hear it as the bad, So then when we take that view, we'll understand even why bad things happen to me, but also even why good things happen to me. Because you flip, when good things happen, people are kind and loving and generous. We just kind of feel, oh, I'm lucky. No, you're not lucky. You created the cause by past virtue and kindness and goodness. If people are mean to you, you must have created that. As much as we don't like to hear that, because we want to kind of push it away, I'm an innocent victim. But the Buddha says we're all in the same boat. We're all complicit in our nightmares, and we're all complicit in our happiness. So when we take it from the big picture point of view, this view of karma, when we take it from the big picture point of view, then we'll start to take responsibility. But it means you've got to know that your happiness is the result of your past actions as well as your suffering. But this is our trouble. We're a bit addicted to the suffering. We're obsessed with our suffering. We're obsessed with the negativity. Sometimes we never stop thinking about how bad we are. It's so terrible. And then we hear karma, and we want to kill ourselves because I am so bad. I must have done this, and I'm the worst person on the planet. We all think we're the worst person on the planet, I mean, that's the irony of ego. We love to hate ourselves. It's so sad. It's so tragic. But if we can take responsibility for all the good things as well, the good things that happen to us and our virtues and our goodness. But when the irony of ego is when we're addicted to the bad, we only see it outside and we only see it in here. This is the tragedy. And this is really the irony of ego. Ego doesn't mean you're some big fat person who goes around bossing everybody. No. Ego is over-exaggerating your own rubbish, over-exaggerating your own badness, over-exaggerating, and therefore over-exaggerating all the badness out there. When we're like that, so okay, what's that got to do with attachment? This is the interesting point. Buddha talks about the 3 toxic emotions, and the fundamental one is this attachment, this emotional hunger inside us, deeply instinctive, a craving, emotional hunger that only ever wants the good things. But its energy is dissatisfaction. This is the big problem. Its energy is dissatisfaction, which is interestingly is like anger. No matter what I get, no matter what practice I do, no matter what I achieve, no matter how many good things I have, no matter how fortunate I am, no matter how many people like me, no matter how hard I work, it is never, ever, ever enough. And all I do is see the bad. This is something we have to recognize. And this is the worst tragedy of ego. And we think it's virtuous to think we're the worst possible person. We almost think it's virtuous to think I'm a bad person, or I must have been bad in a past life. I've created the worst negativity possible. I'm going to go to hell for eternity. That's how the fundamentalism of religion comes. Listen to the fundamentalist religious people. They're like obsessed with negativity. And if we fall into this trap as Buddhists, it is a total tragedy, It's just obsessive. It's neurotic and obsessive. And this is the commonest mistake when we get into spiritual teachings. We become fundamentalist. And that is all to do with the bad, never to do with the good. When we're fundamentalists, all we do is think of the bad. I'm bad. He's bad. She's bad. It's bad. It's so tragic. It's so awful. It's all true. It's all there, but we over-exaggerate it. One of the key functions of all the delusions for the Buddha, attachment and aversion, for example, is that they exaggerate. The bottom line of this negativity is attachment, and it's never getting what it wants. It's a bottomless pit of dissatisfaction. That's the tragedy of attachment. It's a bottomless pit of dissatisfaction. So we're always seeing fault, always seeing the negative, always seeing, as we say, the glass half full, the glass half empty. We're always seeing the negative. We know people like that, and we can see that tendency in ourselves. We all tend to dislike ourselves. We tend to see ourselves as bad. It's kind of ironic, and this is what ego does. It's just tragic when we see this, and we are addicted to it. A person can tell you 1 million times you've got good qualities. We will not believe it. We will not believe it. We will point out the bad. It's like we're addicted to the bad. This we can recognize in others. We can certainly see it in others, and we have to see it in ourselves, because it's the irony of ego. We run to the negativity and they exaggerate, But the basis of it is this attachment, this constant emotional hunger that is never getting satisfaction. That's what drives it. And then always dissatisfaction, and then finding fault. And then we get stuck in that. And we believe, this is the worst one, bad enough. The way Buddha's saying is that these delusions, one of their key functions, the first function is they make us miserable. So check your life and see how you're miserable. Well, that's because you've got delusions, not because the world is terrible. This is the shocking part, actually. It's your delusions. The world is terrible sometimes, but look at your mind, you're miserable because of these delusions. But then the other function of delusions, attachment and aversion and all the others, is that they exaggerate. This is the key thing. They exaggerate, and they're fixed. They're fundamentalist. They're fixed. They're rigid. They're tight and fixed and concrete. This is this. This is that. And we are convinced it is true. Well, as Lama Zopa says, first of all, the delusions are, as Rinpoche says, if delusions are in your mind, like anger, and you talk about yourself, that anger causes you to see the bad things in yourself. And that's fine, they are there, but they're sitting alongside the good things, but you can't see the good things because anger exaggerates the bad. Anger exaggerates the bad. Forget the outside world, look at yourself, The anger in your mind exaggerates the bad. And that's bad enough, Lama Zopa says, that when you see yourself through the lenses of your anger, your dissatisfaction, finding fault. Bad enough that you're seeing yourself in a distorted way. Bad enough you're not seeing yourself properly. But the worst thing is you believe you are right. This is the tragedy. So whether you've got anger towards yourself or anger towards the world, it's exactly the same mistake. So there is suffering in the world and there is negativity inside us. Fact, we have got negativity, but it's not the only thing that's inside us, and it's not the only thing that's in the outside world. But when the delusions are running rampant, that's all they see. But the worst part is, the killer is that we believe it is true. And especially when it comes to ourselves, we delight. Kind of like we act like we found a treasure when we discover another negativity, Look, I've proven it. Look at me. I did this. I'm wrong. 47 people can tell you, you're not as bad as you think, Robina. Oh, yes, I am. And you love to believe it. This is the tragedy of ego. It's the irony. We run like a magnet to negativity. When we can see this in ourselves, we can see it in others. We love to see it in others, but it's painful if we can it's marvelous when we can start to own it. And recognize that we're exaggerating and we're seeing it as fixed. We keep finding reasons to prove we are right. I am bad. I am bad. No, you don't see it. I am bad. This is a terrible tragedy. It's the irony. It's the only way to say it. It's the irony of ego. And then when a person's like that, you just can't help them. They're just stuck in their own misery. They're paralyzed in their misery. They're paralyzed in their disappointment and their negativity and their depression and their anxiety and their anger. And then and there's almost like there's a righteousness about it. That's what fundamentalist people who are religious fundamentalists, religious communists, fundamentalists, anybody. Fundamentalist is a really good word. Buddha talks about ignorance, and one of the main functions of ignorance, the root delusion, is very fixed and concrete, very absolute, black and white, as we say, And that's the opposite to reality. The reality is everything is interdependent. The reality is everything is much more nuanced. We have to learn to see that. That takes courage when it comes to ourselves. It demands humility, actually. It's kind of the reverse of arrogance, to think that you're terrible. So to have humility, to realize you're a regular human being, just like everybody else, no worse and no better, and you've got marvelous potential, and you can change, and just to keep working at it. That's humility, but we love to beat ourselves up. This is the sadness of ego, the tragedy, I tell you. Of course, other people, the other way ego works for other people, they never see anything wrong in themselves and they only see wrong in others. These are the two extremes, aren't they? People who are arrogant and angry and only ever see other people's bad, and they are like a perfect saint. Both are, that's worse in a way because they harm other people, but they both harm that person. When we start to practice, because we start to become a spiritual person, we're trying to be a better person, which is wonderful, to actually attempt to be spiritual on this planet and sincerely attempt to be a better person. is a marvelous thing. But if you turn it into negativity and turn it into fundamentalism, I am bad, I am evil, and rejoice in that. Like you hear all the fundamentalist Christians, and the fundamentalist Muslims, and the fundamentalist religious people. It's revolting to hear the words like that. It's revolting. It's shocking. It's horrible. But that's what our deluded mind does, you know. It's terrible. We're going to be much more humble, much more to ourselves. We destroy ourselves, you know. And when you're fundamentalist like that, everything appears to you exactly through the lenses of your own crazy mind, and you believe with absolute certainty it is the truth. Someone even a million times will tell you it's not quite like that. You just won't be able to believe it. This is the tragedy of that kind of mind, fundamentalist, stuck. It's like, you know, fundamentalist is the best word for it, I tell you. Fixed, concrete. So when the mind can, and that's the function of ego, of the delusions. That's the function of all the delusions. But if you look at the virtues in us, you look at kindness and love and compassion and wisdom and generosity and forgiveness, they're more spacious, they're more nuanced, they're more soft, and they are rooted in interdependence. The neurotic states of mind are rooted in fundamentalism, are rooted in concreteness. The virtues are spacious. The virtues are, when you got virtue in your mind, meaning kindness and patience and forgiveness, let's say towards yourself, you're more soft, you're more spacious, you're more optimistic, you're more courageous. It's what we need to practice. Then we can have that for other people. Then we can have it for other people, you know. So virtues, meaning is the goodness within us. And if we learn to see the difference between attachment and anger and how they make us feel, and then how love and kindness make us feel, there's a huge difference. And when we have the understanding of the three kinds of suffering, even the first two kinds of suffering, which is when the bad things happen, then we understand the second kind, which is the suffering of change, which is when the good things happen, which is rooted in attachment. And we start to understand attachment and how it exaggerates the deliciousness of something. But then when you get that thing, believing you're going to get happiness, it only leads to disappointment because you've exaggerated its goodness. Anger exaggerates the badness. Attachment exaggerates the goodness. Exaggerates the nice things. So these are the problem. So this type of suffering, the second kind of suffering, is really with the suffering of the delusions, the suffering of having attachment and an anger in the first place. And then when we understand that for ourselves and we look at the outside world, we go, wow, we're all in the same boat. You know, I'm in this life now due to my past actions, and this person over there is in this life now due to their past actions. And so you're being harmed or you're being helped, that's due to your past actions. You see a person harming or helping, that's due to their past actions. You've got this bigger picture and you realize we are all in the same boat. Your idea of suffering shifts to include everybody. We're all driven by our past tendencies, good or bad. This is the tragedy. They say the bodhisattvas have the greatest compassion for sentient beings not because we don't realize emptiness, not even that, but because we don't understand cause and effect, that each of us is the creator of our own experiences from past lives. That's the basis of such compassion for others. Because if only good things happen, everybody feels kind of sit on their laurels, or aren't I lucky, the world is so kind to me, and you greedily eat up all the good things, not realizing it's the fruit of your past virtue. And then when the bad things happen, you freak out and panic and blame everybody and feel like despair. You know, how dare the world does this to me? I don't deserve it. So the more we understand attachment and aversion, and how there's this idea, aversion is I don't deserve bad, and attachment is I do deserve good. Both are illogical, Buddha says. That's based on karma. It's like looking at your garden that you've grown that garden, but you forgot. And you see all the fruits and veggies, you go, oh, aren't I lucky? No, you're not lucky. You worked hard. You deserve those flowers. And then you look at the weeds. Who put weeds in my garden? I don't deserve weeds. That's our view of the world. So our world is our garden. Whatever we see in front of us, we grew it, but we forgot. That's the nightmare. We forget. We don't realize cause and effect. We just think the world's good luck and bad luck. I mean, that's complete superstition, Buddha says. It's idiocy. It's nonsense. As Lama Zopa says, the world is our karmic appearance. Whatever we see out there, we created. So when we can own it and see it differently, we have courage and confidence and work on ourselves, and then we can help others. Then we can help others. Look at all the people who help others, no matter how, whether it's political or whatever it is, they've got some kind of groundedness in themselves. You can't help others if you're freaking out. You just destroy others, you know. You're going to help others by leading the way, showing with confidence. Whether it's, you see it, I know from my own political activity days, you know. I remember vividly when I was involved with a kind of, I know, first of all, I was kind of an old Catholic. I gave that up and I became a hippie. Then I became a radical lefty. Then I was supporting in London, in England, in the late 60s, early 70s. A friend of mine, Mary, was a literary agent, and she was a literary agent for George Jackson, one of these Black Panthers in California. It was a very big movement of the Panthers, you know, the whole Black Panther movement in California in the 60s and late 60s. And George Jackson was in prison, and she was the agent. She was his literary agent. So this book of his called The Soledad Brothers got published. So we started a group in London called the Friends of Soledad. I mean, we're white, but we're supporting him. And it was huge at the time. It was really huge. And I remember then you could see, I mean, reading George Jackson's books and reading other books. When you go through the political things yourself, you transform yourself, and then you can help others. I loved Malcolm X. I mean, I didn't like Martin Luther King at the time. I thought he was a bit weak, but I'm so arrogant, you know. But Martin Luther King, I remember he was amazing. He said, this is where you can really see examples of people who work on themselves first, who then can help others. I remember Martin Luther King would say, it's good to be angry. It's good to see the world. It's good to see the fault. But then you say, what can I do to help? That's the courage that comes when you're an activist, you know. But it's got to come from inside. If you're only full of anger, you'll just destroy. But if you got righteousness and you see the problems in the world, first you work on yourself, then you can help others. This is so obvious, you know. And you see the process people go through. You become your own person. And you recognize the suffering of the world and you own it, and then you can help others. This is what we have to be like, you know. And it was a huge learning for me, all those years of my political activity. It led to me meeting the Lamas and then realizing the piece I'd missed all my life was my mind, you know. I spent all my time trying to find the suffering of the world. At first, I always joke. When I was a Catholic, all the world was the problems with the non-Catholics. Then I became a hippie, and the problem with all the straight people. Then I became a radical lefty, and the problem with all the rich people. Then I was involved in all this black politics business, and all the problems with the white people. And then I became a feminist. So of course, all the problems with the male people. Well, I didn't have anybody left. I promise you. I always joke, but it's true. I exhausted all options on the planet for who to blame for the suffering of the world. And then I met these Tibetan Lamas in 1976, 46 years ago, however many years, and I'll never forget. They said, you've missed the main piece, Robina, your mind. I'd never thought of that in my whole life. So here I am, still working on my mind, 46 years later. Anyway, I've been raving on. I'm so sorry. A whole 25 minutes. Now you better ask me some questions. Come on.
Venerable Robina, there's a question in chat.
Yeah.
And let's see here. If you can change your conditions so your attachment gets what it wants and your anger consequently seems to decrease, is that helpful?
Well, it is helpful, but it is helpful. Okay, very good question. If we look at this Lam Rim, this way of presenting the teachings, it's kind of unique to the Tibetans. If you're looking at the very first level of practice, let's look at this. The very first level of practice is at least don't harm others because you don't want future suffering. So you control your body and your speech and you play safe. Now, the next level, which is where we're now talking about this one, your question is in the next level of practice, we get into the mind. So yes, if you can get what attachment wants, at least you will have happy feelings. There's no question. You will have happy feelings. And that surely in the short term is better than having unhappy feelings. Everybody agrees. But this is Buddha's point even the first level of practice, by not killing and stealing and lying and living in discipline and discipline your body and speech, you eventually will get what attachment wants. You will get nice feelings. You will get good things. That is better than nothing. But now we go to the next level and we start to realize that those good feelings, when you go deeper and you start to see attachment, you can have as many good feelings and good things as you like. But when you analyze it, those feelings don't last. And that's the hard part. If you've got so much merit from the past that you always get what you want every second, every piece of cake, every nice word, every beautiful feeling, and some people have lives like that, it's true. But what you don't see, because you're in the thrall of all these lovely things, what you don't see is that will run out. So you have to look at the experience, for example, of getting the cake. The suffering of suffering is when you don't get the cake and you've got this pain and the empty stomach and you're suffering. That's the suffering of suffering, the first kind. The suffering of change is the second kind, where you do get the cake and it does trigger happy feelings. And you go, wow, I've now got happiness. And you are right. But the Buddha says you've got to look deeper. So let's do the analysis. It takes 3 seconds. You get the first mouthful of cake. The feeling that's triggered is definitely delicious. That's called happiness. Happy feelings are in the mind. Unhappy feelings are in the mind. And the external is what triggers them. So you get the cake and it's delicious. But look at this. Have a look. At that moment you get that first mouthful, it does trigger really happy feelings, but you're not satisfied with that happy feeling. So you want another piece of cake. And that's the process that we keep watching. When you realize no matter how much cake you get, it will never, ever be enough. So what happens is you get the cake, you have the first mouthful, it brings happy feelings, but you're not happy with those happy feelings, so you want more. So you have another piece of cake, hoping for better happy feelings. But if you keep eating that cake, you know it'll lead to eventually the third piece of cake. And now what's happened to the happy feelings? They've subtly, without you realizing it, turned into unhappy feelings. Why? Because now the very thing that caused you to have a happy feeling, the cake, is now, after 3 pieces, causing you to have unhappy feelings, and you would vomit if you had another piece. So that you have to analyze. That's a fact. This is scientific. It's not religious. It's not meant to make us miserable. But if you've got lots of merit, you'll keep getting the cake and you'll forget the unhappy feeling and have another piece of cake. Then you have another piece of cake. Then you get more money and have another boyfriend, and you'll keep covering up. So you've got to look inside and see how the actual process of getting the object that you are convinced will bring happy feelings, which is the object of attachment. If you analyze each experience, you'll start to see that all it does is turn into disappointment and unhappiness. But if you rush to the next object without looking, you'll never notice it. So actually, that's the Buddha's point about the second kind of suffering, which is depressing, because we only know how to get, the only way we know how to get happy feelings is to get objects of attachment. And that's why the second kind of practice, giving up attachment, is very difficult. So what's Buddha telling us? He's not trying to make us miserable. You're not allowed to have cake. You know, he's not saying that. What he's actually saying is that he has discovered from his own experience that actually the mind, we have this potential to have unbelievable joy and happiness all the time. That's our natural potential. And the method to get that is to give up attachment. That's the irony, you know. So we think happy feelings come from getting the object of attachment, and they do. But Buddha's point is they don't last. That's all. Whereas he says when you've given up attachment, and indeed anger and the rest, that's when you will have happiness, happy feelings all the time. They won't change into unhappy feelings. And that's advanced. That's what he means by nirvana, finally. But he's saying that's our potential. So it's quite a subtle point to see this. But so it's a very good question. Yes, Salo.
Hello, Venerable Robina. Thank you very much for your teachings.
Okay.
I'm struggling with the difference between karma and destiny.
Well, Buddhism doesn't use the word destiny. That's just a term we use in the West. So you better tell me your definition of destiny. I don't know what you have to give me what you mean by it, because it's not in Buddhist terms. They don't use that word. So what do you mean by destiny, Zara?
I mean that everything that is going to happen is kind of already determined. I mean, there's kind of...
There's no view like that. That's not like that. It's too concrete. There's no view like that in Buddhism. It's much too concrete. So karma is more like, it's like, okay, I know what you mean. That's how we feel. It's very concrete, very fundamentalist. So but let's look at what the meaning of karma is. It's cause and effect. So let's use an example of cause and effect, and we'll call it botany. So you know very well, you learn botany, and you learn to know exactly the name of all the different seeds, and you learn to know the fruits that will come from those seeds. Would you agree in general that's what you do if you're trying to grow a garden? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So that's very precise, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Very precise, isn't it? That a rose seed can only bring a rose bush. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
And a weed seed will only bring a weed. So you could hear that in a concrete way, but it doesn't mean it's not correct. It is correct. But you know that you can pull that seed out anytime you like. You can change the emphasis on that seed by putting other seeds next to it. And so you put the apricot seed next to the rose seed, and the apricot seed gets all the sunlight, and the poor rose seed then withers and doesn't even grow. So it's very interdependent. So there is a law that's very logical of cause and effect, but it's also interdependent, and there's other things that can happen. So you know very well that if let's say I don't know anything about botany, let's say, not a word, never know such a thing as existing, and you've got an acre of land there, and you are a good gardener, and you can then tell me, because you've put all these seeds in the ground. I can't see the seeds, and you know very well, because you know botany, you can predict exactly how your garden will look in 5 years. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Now, that's not fundamentalist, because the rain can come, other laws can come that can make a mess of your garden, but that still doesn't mean it's not correct that those laws apply. They're logical. Well, karma's the same. Negative actions can only ripen as your suffering. Positive actions can only ripen as your happiness. But we can learn to change it. We can apply purification practices. You can put lots of fertilizer onto your seeds. You can mess up the seeds. There's lots of other things that can occur that can interfere with that law. It doesn't argue that the law is not logical. You get my point?
No. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But if I decide to purify my karma, then that's because I have a tendency which is also determined by karma.
Of course, there's nothing that can't be coming from a seed. There's nothing in your garden, Zalo, that doesn't come from a previous seed. There's nothing that can grow that doesn't come from a previous cause. There can't be such a thing. There's an assumption in your question that, is somehow fixed. But if you think of the cause and effect, whatever ripens in your garden, would you agree it comes from a previous cause?
Yes, yes.
And the cause is a seed.
Yes.
I agree. So then whatever rises in your life has coming from a previous cause. And the cause is called your past action. That's all. Same thing. That's all.
And the cost for that cause is also
another one. And that's
karma.
why it's beginningless, Zalo. You can't have a first cause. The Christians have a big discussion about first cause, trying to show how it's valid, which is God. Buddhism would say it's not viable. That's why Buddha would say nothing. You can't have a first cause. We always want a first cause, but everything's very subtle and it goes back and back. Whatever exists has to come from previous causes. So we might have negativity in our mind. It's true, it comes from previous causes, but sitting right alongside those weeds are the flowers. And that's because we've done virtue. Now we can see some people can't even see they've got possibility to change their mind. Some people can't see that. That's because so in other words, if you say to one person, you tell me, before I met Buddhism, when I was a political activist, you tell me that anger causes me suffering, I would have laughed at you. I was not capable of hearing that anger was causing me suffering. My mind had to get a few more years and come along and meet these lamas, and then the karma ripened for me to be able to hear it differently. You with me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you so much.
Good. Very good question. Thank you. What else, people? What else is there, Mary?
There's a follow-up question in chat to the previous question.
Good. Yes.
The person said, I'm still wondering if it creates negative karma, though, to cover up your anger by feeding attachment.
Of course it does. Following delusions, because they're not valid, because they live in la-la land, following delusions can only ever cause suffering because they're not what we think. This is not a fundamentalist point. It's a natural one. It's sort of like, attachment is an over-exaggeration of the deliciousness of something, the value of something. So let's say it's like you've got a $50 note, but you're convinced it's 500. Attachment sees it as 500. So what comes from that attachment is all this eagerness, this expectation, all this hunger, this emotional hunger, the expectation to get your $500 worth. And every time you spend it, you get bitterly disappointed, you get angry, but then you rush off and spend your next one, believing again the same thing. So yes, not being aware of our mind, not seeing the attachment, not seeing the anger, not becoming conscious, not unpacking and being our own therapist, that only can cause suffering. It can only cause insanity. That's what suffering means. We call it insanity. Buddha calls it samsara, It's because we follow delusions and believe their story and keep covering one after the other. So we have to unpack and unravel it all, and that's painful. Coming to terms with our crazy minds is painful. What else is there, Mary? And the other big thing I think when we hear karma, we then get fundamentalists and think, oh, well, I shouldn't be politically active. No, on the contrary, Tibetans are very politically active. There's nothing wrong with being politically active. It's just that for the Tibetans, they know why the suffering of the Chinese communists destroying their culture. They know why it happened, because of big picture karma of countless lives ago. That's why I always tell that story of those young Tibetan nuns. Back in 2003, when I was in San Francisco running the prison project, and Richard Gere contacted, and we're going to kind of collaborate on working on some project with prisoners when Dalai Lama came to New York, but he ended up doing his own thing. So he invited 20 former prisoners to meet the Dalai Lama. And it was a wonderful day. Some people like me were invited who work with people in prison. Some of my friends from prison who'd come out, who'd done kind of meditation in prison. And they had a wonderful day talking of their own suffering and all. It was a cross section of Americans, you know, black, white, Puerto Rican, Mexican Americans, male, female. And they had a wonderful day and they met His Holiness. It was a very moving day, you know. And then he's also invited 2 young Tibetan nuns. And I always tell this story. You must have heard it many times if you've heard me. These young women, you know, young nuns since they're born. In other words, they're Buddhists since they're born. And that means the Buddhist views, all these views we're discussing here, are in the bones of these young women. They brought up with these views since they're born. You know, that's their culture. It's just natural to them that karma is the view that runs the world. It's a new view to us. We're shocked. For them, it's the most natural thing. It's been in Asia for 3,000 years. So they were sexually abused and tortured for a couple of years in prison. And they were talking about their suffering. There's an interesting point here when we unpack anger and attachment, you know, let's do that here. So what you could see very clearly from these women, these young women's way of describing, they weren't angry. So let's analyze this. We could spend an hour just on this. Attachment and anger it's kind of philosophical views, really. They're assumptions. So the energy of attachment is this assumption deep in our bones that I only deserve good things. So we know in our lives, the millisecond that attachment is thwarted and the bad thing happens. What happens? We get upset, angry, irritated, frustrated, upset, enraged, or internalized, depressed. Because why? Listen, because anger is, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. If we look at those words, attachment and anger sound so cute, but they're the assumptions built into these views. They're deep psychological, philosophical views, deep in the bones of our being. And the Buddha says, these are what are breaking our heart. These are what are causing us suffering, because they're not valid assumptions. They're distorted, but they're totally instinctive. So these young women, having the view of karma, which happens to be the worldview that they've lived in and the Tibet has been had for 1,000 years before, and has been in Asia 2,000 years before that, is that there are trillions of sentient beings. Our minds have got countless past lives. Everything we do creates our own happiness and our own suffering. So they accept that view that makes sense to them. So all that period of being abused and tortured, of course they didn't like it. Who wants to be abused and tortured? Nobody. But they have a view that explains it to them, which they buy into. So that informs their practice. So therefore they were not angry. They didn't have the thought, how dare they do this to us? We do not deserve it. They didn't have that view because they have the view of karma. It doesn't mean it wasn't easy for them. It was intensely difficult to have that suffering, to accept it, to understand it, and to work with it daily. And then, as one of them said at the end of their talk, there were tears, you know, discovering this suffering they had. And of course, she said, we had compassion for our torturers because we know we must have harmed them in the past. And because we know that they will suffer in the future. Now, this is taking, all those statements is coming from the view of karma, which is in the bones of their being. So it's a massive one for us that don't have that view. We have the view that we didn't ask to get born, that it's not fair. Good things should happen, we only deserve good, and bad things shouldn't happen because we don't deserve bad. I mean, that's the view we have. That's the philosophical view we have. Well, Buddha calls that samsaric. There's no valid basis for that view, he says. And this is why we suffer. This is what he's saying. Of course, this is intense. Got to look into this, unpack and unravel these concepts. Not easy. It's so automatic, so instinctive, you know. What else, people? And then when we've got this view, in other words, that's why I like to use the Dalai Lama as an example. Have a look at him. Everybody in the world who knows about him thinks he's a lovely person. Well, the communists don't. They hate him. So, okay, think about it. Please think about it. He was born in 1935. when he was 16 years old in 1950, he became the boss of Tibet. He was 16, for God Almighty's sake. He became the boss of Tibet. He hasn't stopped since 1950, and now it's 2022. He has not stopped for 1 second being a happy fellow. Have you noticed? I mean, people, use your eyes. Have you not noticed he's a happy fellow? This should blow our minds. But he hasn't stopped trying to help Tibetan people get their country back. And he hasn't stopped trying to help the world, politically, socially, philosophically, spiritually, diplomatically. He just doesn't stop. So we should think, well, that's an interesting example. If that works for him, I wonder what he must do. I might give it a go. That to me is very perfect. If you see a person playing the piano, you go, wow, look at that. I'd like to do that. You see the proof of the pudding, you know. So he's the proof of the pudding, in my opinion. So whatever he did, I'm happy to follow. I'm happy to do whatever he did because I'd like to be like him, please. That's the most perfect way you can use logic. And that's why we've got to have examples. You can't learn piano by just reading the bare piece of paper. You've got to have people playing piano in front of you. You can't practice this stuff if you don't have people in front of you who are showing you what it's like to have practiced this. They're the proof of the pudding, you know. Gives you great courage.
Robina, Samia has a question.
Good, Samia, darling. What is your question? Unmute.
Sorry.
Go.
Just in terms of thinking about karma. So when I hear that story, we'll use that as an example of the two nuns, or, you know, the view of karma that, okay, this is happening to me. But also it makes me think, but there must be also a karma of taking an action to that, to saying, you know, this is not okay.
That's
that
right.
These people are being
That's right.
raped.
That's right.
And I need to take this action because that's my karma to act that
Yes.
way.
Exactly. So I think that's my point about the Dalai Lama. That's exactly why I use him as the example. Those particular women were at that moment had just come out of prison, you know. They probably do act, but they were discussing their experience. And that's why, exactly, Samia, that's exactly why I use the example of the Dalai Lama, because that's exactly what he's doing. He has the view in his mind of karma. That's his view of the universe, but he hasn't stopped acting. So you're absolutely right. And that's why I started this whole conversation by saying that when we think of karma, sometimes we think that means no action. No, absolutely not. That's why I mentioned Martin Luther King. He didn't talk about karma, of course, he was a Christian, but he said, it is good to find fault. It is good to see there is fault. But then you say, what can I do to help? And that's why I use the Dalai Lama. He doesn't sit there watching his navel, which is what people think Buddhists do. He's never stopping for 65, 70 years. He hasn't stopped trying to fix it. That's the point. And that's the interesting point about karma. Yeah, go on. Yeah, good.
Oh, well, my next part with that is that I don't know if it necessarily needs to bring you happiness.
Which one? Which view?
Well, you act, you act, and it doesn't. You act even if it doesn't bring you happiness,
no,
because it's the right thing to do.
No, well, this is an interesting point. No, good point. Thank you. The first one, the one these nuns were going through, expressing that to me like is the wisdom wing. Now, on the basis of that, you now think, how can I help others? And that's based on not on that. The second one, action, isn't based on whether it'll bring you happiness, because you're working on your own mind will bring you happiness and contentment, but helping others is the point that drives you to help out, is to act. So that's coming from compassion. That's why Martin Luther King, it's good to act, but how can I help? So then when you're driven first from the wisdom wing, you come to terms with your own stuff, you accept it, you move, and then you've now got the courage to help others. So compassion is what drives the action. It's hard work, but there's also satisfaction in it, I'd say, because you know you're doing something. And there's no fantasy expectation that Australia is going to suddenly become non-racist in 1 month, you know? Because Samia, tell us about your political work. Samia, tell us about it.
Well, I guess right now it's more, I'm focusing more on, and it does come from what's happening to yourself, because that develops an empathy and an understanding of your lived experience.
That's right.
So for me, you know, as you know, I've been dealing with very difficult disability and health challenges. And so I see the way people are treated in the system around their disability and becoming non-people and not getting treated properly. So then I am in a position, I advise to a minister on suicide and mental health, and I then say, well, we need to do something about this, because it's not okay to cut these services, because then these people will really suffer. But, you know, it's tiring to do that, but I don't necessarily
you might have a
benefit, but
happy,
I would have more suffering not to act.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the acting is hard work and you get tired, but satisfaction is what you get. And in a way, satisfaction is another type of happiness. Happiness doesn't mean like all happy and silly. Satisfaction is that. So then when you know,
and I think that's a big realization that I've had.
That's right. Good.
I just think it's helpful for other people. Like, it's taken me my life to get to this, to go, you know, I've struggled with this for a long time. And, you know, therapists and people, they might say to you, oh no, don't look at this, or don't get involved in that, you know, just take care of yourself. And then I've been able to go, you know, but my nature is that I would suffer more not to act.
You don't help others. And that's the point too, Samia, that if you're so overwhelmed by your own suffering, you can't lift a finger to help others. It's only when you've done the inner work that you can then see, oh my God, we're all in the same boat. That's why the compassion wing comes second. Do you understand? So it's perfect.
Yes.
Darling. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, that's it. People.
No, thank you.
And that's Australia, by the way, where they got free medical. So you can only imagine the suffering right now. One of my friends, he's helping a person who's got a stroke. The guy can't get treatment because he's got no money. He's chucked out of the hospitals. I mean, this is in this country where I'm in America. I'm allowed to criticize America. I've got an American passport. But it's like unbelievable.
It's very much like that here now.
I know, but still, Australia's still got free medical. That's the miracle. That's something you don't realize, something you can't imagine what it's like here. You can't.
I do, because I lived there for a long time.
Oh, well, there you go. So you know. Okay. Anyway, so we're all in the same boat. Okay, people, it's time to go. 1 whole hour. I hope there's some useful thoughts there. It was helpful for me. Thank you very much for allowing me to rave on. Shout as usual. Thank you, everybody. Keep moving. Never give up. Work on yourself. Deal with your own rubbish. Know you have potential. Don't get obsessed about your negativity. This is the worst crime against yourself. It's the worst crime against yourself. Please stop having so much negativity about yourself. Have space. See the goodness. See that it's more nuanced than we think. And then we have hope. And then never give up. And then we can help others. All right, people. Thank you, darlings.
Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you. Much love.